thinking, what in the world is he doing? How is he going to tie that into something? Well, hang on and we'll do something here. That poor coyote, Dave, I'm just a little, there you go. That poor coyote failed 641 times. Now, if you sit there and you seen that little counter on the side, if we would have sat there and watched all 32 minutes of that and counted down to 641 fails, I guarantee you somewhere in the middle of that, we would have seen somewhere that coyote run off the edge of a cliff. He run off the edge of a cliff. I didn't sit and watch that whole thing just so I could find that one clip. Y'all just bear with me here. I guarantee you, somewhere in those 641 fails, he run off the edge of a cliff. He was falling down the cliff, and as he was falling, he reached and grabbed a twig. Didn't he? He reached and grabbed a twig, and while he's hanging onto this twig, he hangs there for a minute. And all of a sudden, the twig breaks. It breaks, and he starts falling some more, doesn't he? He keeps on falling. And as he falls, you see this pitiful look on his face. And he's thinking, what in the world did I do? It doesn't matter, though, how strong he was holding on to that twig, does it? It don't matter how hard or how strong his grip was on that twig. When the twig broke, he fell. Today, we want to keep that picture in mind. Keep that picture in mind of that coyote hanging on the side of that cliff, hanging onto that twig as we talk about faith. But you see, the key to great faith, listen to what I'm saying here, the key to great faith is not how strong your faith is. It's more about what your faith is holding on to. Right? If faith holds on to a breakable twig, then no matter how strong your grip is, that faith will fail. Just like that cartoon character. His 641 fails starting in 1949 to whenever they quit making it. That poor critter got blowed up, run over, crushed or something 641 times. But the faith that holds on to the promises of God, that faith will never fail. For the Lord's promises never break, do they? They never break like that twig. And this morning, I want us to look at 4 different individuals and their faith. And 3 of these have incredible faith. But there's one that begged for his faith to be strengthened. And the first one I want us to look at is found in Matthew 8. Found in Matthew 8, and I'm starting at verse 5. It says, when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed in terrible agony. I will come heal him, he told him. Basically, Jesus told him. Lord, the centurion replied, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the words, and my servant will be cured. Skip down to verse 10. Skip down to verse 10. Hearing this, Jesus was amazed, and he said to those following him, I assure you that I have not found anyone in Israel with so great a faith. During Jesus' day, Jewish people were ruled and oppressed by the Roman Empire. And a centurion was a Roman soldier who was in charge of 100 more individuals. And centurions were feared. They were hated by Jewish people. And this Gentile centurion recognized Jesus' authority. Now, was this centurion worthy enough? Was he loving enough? Had he done enough? No, he didn't. The fact that the Roman centurion was one of the least worthiest people. He even admits that himself in verse 8. He says, I am not worthy to have you even come into my house, to come under my roof. And just as the centurion recognizes how unworthy he is and how worthy Jesus is, he also knows that Jesus has the ultimate authority. Just as he knows God has the power to speak things into creation, just like God spoke the world into creation. We don't know exactly how this centurion came to trust God, the God of the Israelites. But there's no doubt that the miracles of his faith was a gift from God. The centurion came to Jesus with humility and acknowledging him, acknowledging his authority by his faith. What even is faith? What is faith? How does it affect our relationship with Jesus? Look at Hebrews 11. What does it say? Hebrews 11 says, faith is the reality of what is hoped for and the proof of what is not seen. Faith is believing in something even if it hasn't been proven or yet come true. The centurion made the healing of his servant a reality by putting his faith in Jesus. Jesus proved the centurion's faith was real. He proved his own holiness in the act of a miraculous healing of that servant. Look at the last part of verse 10. Chapter 8, verse 10. Look at the last part of that again. It says, I assure you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great a faith. This was just a Gentile, a centurion, a Roman centurion at that. And Jesus brags on him in front of everybody else. Now, the next individual with great faith is in Mark chapter 5. And let's look at verse 21. It says, when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and kept begging him to help. He kept begging him, my little daughter is at death's door. Come, lay your hands on her so she can get well and live. So Jesus went with him, and the large crowd was following and pressing against him. And this passage tells the story of Jairus. Am I saying that right? Jairus? There's not no E-S on there. Jairus. Okay. I kept trying to call it Jarvis all the time, but there's no V in there. But so, Jairus. He's a synagogue leader. And he approached Jesus in a desperate need. His precious daughter was severely ill. And he believed Jesus can heal her. So Jairus falls at Jesus' feet and he begs him. He begs him for his help. And his faith in Jesus is evident as he pleads for Jesus to come with him and lay his hands on his daughter so she could be healed, so she could be restored. Jesus agrees to go with him, and they set out for his house. However, what did it say at the last verse there? There's a large crowd that was gathered around, and it was pressing in around them. And it was making progress for them to get where they wanted to go very, very slow. And in the Old Testament, there are certain laws and regulations that may seem confusing to us. And one of these laws is found in Leviticus 15. And it says when a woman has a regular flow of blood, anyone who touches her is considered unclean until evening. If this continues many days past the normal time it's supposed to, I'm trying to be politically correct here and do this with small ears involved. So if it continues past what it usually does, anyone who touches her will also be unclean. Even that, then they must go wash themselves and wash their clothes in water before evening. Now here's our third person that shows a great faith. And it's found in Mark, still chapter 5. And it's the next verse. You say, well, wait a minute, Jimmy. What happened to Jarvis's daughter? We skipped her. No, we didn't skip her. We'll double back here in a little bit. We'll just start taking a little sidetrack here. We'll double back to Jarvis's daughter just here in a second. Let's look at verse 25, which is the next verse down from where I stopped. It says, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his robe. For she said, if I can just touch his robe, I'll be made well. Instantly her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was cured of her affliction. While Jesus and Jairus and his disciples and the crowd was on their journey to this Jairus' house, this woman who had been suffering from this bleeding condition for a long time approached Jesus secretly. She believed that if she could just touch him, if she could just touch his garment, his robe, any part of him, that she would be made well, that she would be healed. So with great faith, she reaches out. She makes her way through the crowd. She reaches out and she touches his clothing. Instantly, she experienced complete healing. This could be the most remarkable miracle performed by Jesus. Yeah, he turned water into wine. He cured blind eyes, caused the lame to walk, and to raise people from the dead was pretty incredible. But instantly, she was healed. This involved a woman who had been suffering for such a long time. This woman had endured terrible suffering under the care of many doctors and had spent just about everything she had. And unfortunately, instead of getting better, her condition worsened. This woman had been dealing with the ongoing issue for 12 years. This meant that she had been ceremonially unclean for that long. Her condition had drained her financially. She had spent everything she had without any improvement. She was in constant pain due to her condition. She was considered a social outcast and had lived in isolation to avoid making others unclean. Can you imagine dealing with an issue every day for 12 years? 4,383 days. Dealing with physical and emotional pain. She was confined at home or in a tent or wherever she was, isolated from society, and felt as though if she had just as good as dead. Then she hears about Jesus, and she knows he's the great healer. And she believed if she could just touch the hem of his garment, that she'd be healed. Despite risking making him unclean. So she musters up the courage. And she works her way through the crowd, and she reaches out and she touches him. And as she reaches out, she brushes her hand against the tassels of his garment. She immediately felt a change in her body. A tingling sensation, a warmth coursed through her. And she knew she had been healed. It's often at our lowest moments, that we come closest to God. When we are stripped of pride and arrogance, when we have nothing to rely on except God. That's when we can hear him the most clearly, isn't it? And it may be a painful journey. To reach the point that we're looking for. But when we do, God is there for us. Jesus could have done or said just anything at that moment. But he chose to turn the spotlight on her. She basically just wanted to simply just slip through the crowd and go on home, probably. But he wanted her healing to be known to all. He wanted everyone to see that she had been healed and that it was now safe to touch her. It's critical. It's critical for us to give God glory when a miracle happens, isn't it? We're not supposed to just assume that that's a natural phenomenon or whatever and go on with it. When something happens, we should give God glory and give him praise for whatever happens. This woman was healed not because Jesus wanted her healed or because she was the only one there in need. I'm sure there was others in the crowd in need. She was healed because of her great faith. Faith plays a significant role in receiving healing. There may have been like I said, someone in the crowd that needed that healing. But not all of them were there for healing. Some of them may have been just there for the entertainment that maybe they thought they was going to see. Not truly believing in his power. They'd heard some rumors of what Jesus had done. Maybe they wanted to see it for themselves. But this woman had faith. That is why she was relieved of her ailment. Jesus, knowing her faith, he told her, verse 34, the very first part of that. He said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." There was no need for her to perform any sacrifices. There was no need for her to obey any complexity of laws or anything like that. Jesus proclaimed a word of deliverance, and she was healed. And while all of this is going on, all of this is happening, some messengers arrive from Jairus' house and informing him that his daughter had died. And they urged him to quit bothering Jesus anymore. But don't you imagine that Jairus was overwhelmed about this time? He's probably overwhelmed with grief. He's probably overwhelmed with regret. Probably a little bit of anger in there too, wouldn't you think? He's probably thinking that if we had only not gotten delayed, if the crowd would have been out of the way, if this woman wouldn't have held up the show, perhaps we would have got there before my daughter died. But Jesus reassures him in the last part of verse 36. He says, "Don't be afraid, only believe." Jesus continues to Jairus' house, accompanied by Peter, James, and John. And on arriving, they come across mourners. They come across mourners already grieving the girl's death. Jesus states that she isn't dead, but asleep, causing these mourners to laugh in disbelief. He dismisses them. He orders them out. He gets rid of them. He orders them to leave. Then he enters the girl's room with her parents and his disciples, and he speaks softly to her, and Jesus commands the girl to get up. And immediately she gets up, alive and well. That's our three individuals that had an enormous amount of faith. Now our individual that needed his faith strengthened. He's still in the book of Mark. He's down just a few more chapters, down to chapter 9. Jesus and his three disciples had just returned from what was called the transfiguration of Jesus. A visual glimpse of his divine nature. And they arrived back to what must have been a chaotic and a disordered scene. After the beauty of the being on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus and all of that, what had happened, they come back, and the other disciples were surrounded by a crowd. And they were arguing with some of the teachers of the law. And a man had brought his son, who was possessed by an evil spirit, and this spirit had been tormenting this boy for many years. And the disciples hadn't been successful. They didn't have any luck. They were unsuccessful, there you go, of healing him. They didn't have any luck casting the demon out, the spirit out. And now we're in a heated discussion with the teachers of the law. When the Father saw Jesus, when he saw Jesus coming, he turned to him and he explained to him the situation. Then he added that the disciples couldn't drive the spirit out. Jesus' rebuke is the first mention of unbelief in this passage. In verse 19, he said, "You unbelieving generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you?" When asked more about the boy's condition, the man answered and then gave a plea. In the last part of verse 22, he says, "But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." In this one sentence is a mix of discouragement and a weak kind of hope. Jesus recognizes this, and in the first part of the next verse, he says, "If you can." He then offers the long-suffering father a better perspective at the last part of that verse right there. He says, "Everything is possible to the one who believes." The well-known response puts this man's heart on display. And it shows us that we can take the steps to grow our faith the same way. Look at the last part of verse 24. Last part of verse 24, it says, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." He states his love for God. He admits that his faith is not as strong as it could be. In other words, a weakness in his spirit. He asked Jesus to change him. A willingness to be made stronger. While walking along the shores of the Dead Sea one time, a man lost his balance and he fell into the water. Well, it was at a point that was kind of deep. And this man, never having learned how to swim, he started to panic. He started to panic and he started to thrash around, flopping his arms and his legs, and thinking that he was going to drown. And he felt like now he's at complete exhaustion, and he feels like there's nothing else he can do. So he cries out to God for help. He's prepared for the worst. What a surprise awaits him. As soon as he relaxed, the water bore him up. He had forgotten that the Dead Sea was so full of salt and other minerals that if a person lies still, they can easily float on its surface. They won't drown as long as they submit to the buoyancy of the water. This simple story has a sincere lesson in it. A sincere lesson for us who are the Lord's children. His everlasting arms are holding us. If we simply just give up, if we simply just part with, if we simply just hand over our unnecessary fears and stop our fleshly efforts of trying to make things better. If we will quit our hearts in our most desperate hours of difficulty, the eternal God is a never-failing help. Amen? I'll give you these last thoughts here in closing. The centurion soldier believed in Jesus' authority, while most of the Jewish people there did not. A Roman centurion who wasn't even an Israelite had more faith than the people who grew up with Jesus and saw him live a perfect life. So let's not be the people who amaze Jesus at our unbelief. The story of Jesus healing the woman with the issue of blood is a powerful witness to the importance of the faith and compassion of our Savior. It reminds us that in our most desperate moments, Jesus is there, ready to help us, ready to heal us, ready to restore us. May we always have the faith in Him and give glory for every miracle He performs. In the story of Jairus, we witness the unwavering faith. A father who loved his daughter so deeply, so strongly, despite the delay, despite the tragic news of her death. Delays are often seen as hindrances, aren't they? They're often seen as setbacks. But God has a divine plan. Jairus held on to that faith. He held on to that faith, and he held on to that hope, and trusted in Jesus' ability to heal. Jesus honored that faith and restored his daughter to life. When we face delays and detours, let's remember that God is at work. And His timing is perfect. In our main text this morning in Matthew 9:24, the last part of that, it says, I do believe, help my unbelief. This cry came from a man who was heartbroken over the state of his son. He was desperately hoping that Jesus' disciples could help. And when they couldn't, a little bit of that doubt started to creep in. Jesus' words that prompted the cry for help were both a gentle reprimand and a reminder that he needed at that time. When he said, everything is possible to the one who believes. We all have a need to hear that in our Christian journey. There have been times when we've veered into doubt. whether our attitude came out, or fears, or even impatience. It has revealed a weak area in us, hasn't it? But in the conversations and the healings of these accounts that we just talked about, we can find reassurance and hope that our faith can always keep growing, become stronger in our faith is a lifelong process. The great news is we are not expected to mature on our own, are we? God will do the work in our hearts. But we do have an important part to play in His plan, though. How much we grow in our belief over time depends on how willing we are to let go of trying to have the control, to submit to God's will, and trust in God's abilities. So what are you holding on to? Are you holding on to a twig? Or we're holding on to the strong arms of God? Amen.